I had always been drawn to abandoned places, the ones where you can almost hear the whispers of the past. So, when I heard the stories about that old hospital on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to go. Everyone warned me against it. They talked about a fire that swept through the place years ago, leaving behind the souls of patients who were never able to escape. Some locals even claimed they could hear faint cries at night or see shadowy figures moving inside the broken windows. Despite these warnings, I felt an almost magnetic pull toward that place. Curiosity outweighed my fear. So, I packed my camera and some basic supplies, and I set out on a foggy morning. The drive was long, the road winding through stretches of woods until it finally opened up to reveal the hospital standing alone, looming against a pale, overcast sky. The building was massive, its once pristine facade now stained and cracked. Vines and ivy crawled up its sides, choking the life out of the place. I parked my car and walked up to the entrance, my heart thumping in my chest. The silence was eerie. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive stillness that wrapped around me like a cold, damp blanket. I took a deep breath and pushed on the rusted metal door. It groaned loudly as it opened, the sound echoing through the dark, empty halls. It felt like the whole building was welcoming me, or maybe warning me. Inside, I flicked on my flashlight, and its beam cut through the dust-laden air. I found myself in a long corridor lined with peeling paint and shattered tiles. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of rot and decay. I took a step forward, and the sound of my footstep echoed unnervingly down the hallway. It was as if the hospital was alive, breathing, waiting for me to venture further into its depths. The deeper I ventured into the hospital, the heavier the air seemed to grow. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of decaying walls, shattered windows, and rusted gurneys abandoned in the hallways. As I moved forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence was oppressive, pressing against my ears like the calm before a storm. I passed by what looked like an old nurse's station, its countertop covered in dust and grime. Papers were scattered everywhere, some of them charred at the edges as if they had narrowly escaped the fire. I reached for one, brushing off the dust to see what it said, but the words were blurred and faded, almost as if the paper was trying to hide its story from me. Continuing down the hallway, I began to hear faint sounds. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, the creak of wood, the rustle of debris shifting in the wind. But then I realized it wasn't random noise. It was rhythmic, almost like the sound of distant footsteps or breathing. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The sound stopped too. An icy chill ran down my spine, and I forced myself to take another step. As soon as I did, the noise resumed, now accompanied by what sounded like the faint shuffle of movement. I shone my flashlight around, but the beam only revealed more empty rooms and hallways, each one more shadowed and foreboding than the last. I told myself it was just the echoes of my own movements, bouncing off the crumbling walls. I pressed on, turning a corner into a ward that still had beds lined up on either side. Most of them were covered with old, moldy sheets, but a few were bare, their metal frames twisted and rusted. I walked down the aisle between the beds, the hairs on my neck standing on end. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered, casting brief flashes of light across the room. In one of those flashes, I thought I saw a figure standing at the far end of the ward. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, pointing the flashlight in that direction. But there was nothing there now, just an empty, darkened room. As I moved through the building, the halls began to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. I glanced back, expecting to see the way I came, only to find the corridor stretching out endlessly behind me. My nerves were fraying, and each step felt heavier than the last. My only guide was the beam of my flashlight, casting a small circle of light that barely illuminated the way forward. I soon found myself in front of what looked like an operating room. The door was slightly ajar, a faint line of darkness leaking out as if the room itself was exhaling. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door. I didn't want to go in, but some strange force seemed to pull me toward it, urging me to confront whatever was inside. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped in. The air inside was cold, much colder than the rest of the hospital. My flashlight swept across the room, revealing old surgical tables, rusted tools scattered on metal trays, and cabinets hanging open with their contents spilled out. I stepped forward, and my foot hit something hard. I looked down to see a set of surgical instruments on the floor, arranged in a line, pointing toward the back of the room. A shiver crawled up my spine. I crouched down, picking up one of the scalpels. Its blade was dulled and tarnished. But as I turned it over in my hand, I noticed something on the handle, a faint inscription that read, "Time doesn't heal all wounds." My heart pounded as the room suddenly grew darker. The flashlight flickered wildly before going out completely, plunging me into pitch-black silence. I fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against my palm until it flickered back on. My hands were shaking, and I could barely steady the beam. I swung it around the room, the light catching on every surface, every shadow. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement, a faint, dark shape gliding silently along the far wall. I turned the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I backed away, my breath quickening. I needed to get out of this room, out of this hospital. I turned and made my way to the door, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. But just as I reached for the handle, I heard it, a whisper so soft I could have imagined it. "Help me." I froze, my hand hovering over the door. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as if someone was standing right beside me. "Please, help me." I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was barely visible in the dim light, a faint outline that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. I pointed the flashlight at it, and for a brief moment, I saw it clearly. A person, dressed in what looked like an old hospital gown, their face pale and twisted with fear. Their eyes met mine, pleading, before the light blinked out again. When the flashlight flickered back on, they were gone. The room was empty once more, but the air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. I rushed out of the operating room, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I paused for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. What did I just see? A ghost? A trick of the light? I had to keep reminding myself that I was here to document the hospital, to find the truth behind the legends. But the more I explored, the less the place felt like a crumbling building and more like a living entity. The hallway ahead stretched out before me, dimly lit by the flickering flashlight in my hand. I moved forward cautiously, trying to retrace my steps back to the entrance. But the more I walked, the less familiar the surroundings became. The hospital's layout had changed. What had once been a straight corridor now twisted and branched off into multiple directions, with some paths leading to dead ends. I stopped and turned around, shining the light back the way I came. The corridor behind me had changed too. It was now a narrow passageway lined with doors that hadn't been there before. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I was lost. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, though my voice trembled. I chose one of the paths and started walking, hoping it would lead me back to a familiar part of the hospital. But as I moved, the air grew colder, and a faint mist began to form along the floor. The whispers returned, soft and indistinct at first, then growing louder, echoing off the walls. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they carried a sense of urgency, a warning. After what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled into an open room. It was different from the others I had seen, a children's ward. Small beds lined the walls, each covered with faded, moth-eaten blankets. Some of the beds had old toys scattered on them, a teddy bear missing an eye, a wooden horse with chipped paint. A sense of sadness hung in the air, so heavy that I could almost taste it. I walked further in, the light from my flashlight revealing faded murals on the walls, cheerful animals and balloons, now dulled by time and decay. As I approached one of the beds, I noticed something unsettling. A small, worn-out shoe lay on the floor beside it, as if left behind in a hurry. I crouched down to pick it up, my heart heavy with a mixture of fear and sorrow. That's when I heard it, a faint giggle, soft and echoing. I froze, the shoe still in my hand. The giggle was followed by the sound of small footsteps pattering across the room. I shot up, my flashlight darting around to find the source. In the beam of light, shadows danced along the walls, fleeting and indistinct. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely steady. For a moment, the room fell silent. Then, slowly, one of the beds at the far end of the ward creaked, as if someone had just sat down on it. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a step back, my flashlight aimed directly at the bed. The light flickered, and for a split second, I saw the outline of a child sitting there, staring back at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. The bed was empty again, the room silent except for the pounding of my heart. I backed away toward the door, my skin crawling with the sense that I was being watched. The air grew colder, and I knew I had to get out of there before the hospital decided to show me something I couldn't handle. I turned and left the children's ward, my legs trembling as I hurried down the hallway. I needed to find a way out, and fast. Just as I was about to take another corner, I spotted something up ahead, an old elevator. Its doors were partially open, revealing a dark, empty shaft within. A faint light glowed from the buttons beside it, one of which was illuminated with the number B for the basement. Against my better judgment, I approached the elevator. Maybe the basement would have another exit, I reasoned. Or perhaps it held the answers I was seeking. With a shaky hand, I pressed the B button. The elevator groaned to life, the doors screeching closed with a sound that set my teeth on edge. Inside, it was pitch black, and I had to fight the urge to turn back. The elevator jerked violently, then began its descent. The ride was agonizingly slow, accompanied by the sound of grinding metal and faint whispers. The temperature dropped the farther down I went, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I clutched the flashlight in my hand, its light bobbing with each shudder of the elevator. Then suddenly it stopped. The doors creaked open, revealing a long, dark corridor. My flashlight flickered, casting a dim glow over the floor, which was slick with something wet. I stepped out cautiously, the air heavy with the scent of mold. I had entered the basement, the hospital's heart of darkness. As I moved down the corridor, I came across a set of metal double doors. They were heavy, with the word morgue faintly visible on a rusted plaque above them. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment, fear and curiosity warring inside me. I needed to know what lay beyond those doors, what secrets the hospital was hiding. I pushed them open, and a wave of cold air hit me, carrying with it the stench of decay. Inside, rows of metal slabs lined the room, some with rusting drawers built into the walls. The light from my flashlight revealed faint stains on the floor, dark and indistinguishable. The room was deathly silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your skin crawl. I walked further in, my steps echoing in the stillness. As I approached one of the slabs, I noticed it was covered with a stained white sheet. I hesitated, then reached out to lift a corner. The moment my fingers touched the fabric, a loud clang echoed through the room. I jumped back, my heart racing as I swung the flashlight toward the noise. One of the drawers in the wall had flown open, its contents hidden in the shadows. I approached it slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. I shone the flashlight into the drawer and recoiled in horror. It was empty, but the inside was scratched and gouged, as if someone or something had tried to claw their way out. The realization sent a chill through me. The hospital wasn't just haunted by its past. It was alive, and it was showing me exactly what it wanted me to see. My heart pounded as I backed away from the open drawer. I needed to leave the morgue, to escape this place that seemed to feed off fear and suffering. I turned quickly, heading for the double doors. As I pushed through them and back into the hallway, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I froze. At the far end of the corridor stood a figure, barely visible in the darkness. It was only there for a second before disappearing into the shadows. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself that it was just my imagination. The hospital was playing tricks on me, using the darkness and the echoes to disorient me. Still, I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I moved forward, following the corridor as it twisted and turned in ways that made no logical sense. As I walked, the walls around me began to change. They were no longer covered in peeling paint and grime, but adorned with old photographs, yellowed with age. I stopped to examine one. It showed a group of doctors and nurses standing in what looked like the hospital's lobby. Their faces were grim, their eyes hollow. There was something off about the photo, something that made my skin crawl. The hallway continued to change as I moved forward, the photographs on the walls growing more disturbing. I saw images of patients lying in hospital beds, their faces obscured or blurred. In some photos, shadowy figures loomed in the background, barely noticeable unless you look closely. The whispers in the air grew louder, forming fragmented sentences. "Remember us. Don't forget," they pleaded, filling my mind with a mix of sorrow and fear. I quickened my pace, desperately searching for an exit, but the corridor stretched on, endless, like a tunnel with no light at the end. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. It was then that I realized this wasn't just a hospital. It was a place where memories had been trapped, where time had frozen in moments of suffering and despair. I began to run, panic surging through me as the walls closed in. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices echoing off the walls, each one overlapping the other. "Leave! You don't belong here, remember?" They chanted, creating a disorienting chorus. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get out. Suddenly, the corridor opened into the main lobby of the hospital. I stumbled forward, my flashlight beam sweeping over the empty room. There was the entrance door. It stood slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light peeking through from the outside world. My heart leapt. I sprinted toward it, every nerve in my body screaming to escape. As I reached the door, it slammed shut in front of me with a force that made me stagger back. "No!" I yelled, grabbing the handle and pulling with all my strength. The door wouldn't budge. The hospital wasn't letting me go. I pounded on the door in desperation, my breath ragged and shallow. "Let me out!" I screamed, but the only response was the echo of my own voice, bouncing back at me in the darkness. I turned around, pressing my back against the door. The lobby stretched out before me, empty yet filled with an overwhelming sense of presence. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that filled the air. In the middle of the lobby, a shadowy figure began to materialize. It was vague and undefined, like a mist that had taken form. The figure moved closer, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I had to make a choice. I closed my eyes, gripping the flashlight tightly. "You're not real," I muttered, forcing myself to stand tall. "You're just an echo, a memory of this place." The figure paused, flickering in the dim light. I opened my eyes, meeting its gaze, or what should have been its gaze. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire hospital held its breath. Then, the figure began to dissipate, unraveling into the air like smoke caught in the wind. The humming faded, replaced by an almost peaceful silence. The tension in the room lifted, and I turned back to the door. I reached for the handle again, and, this time, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing the gray, cloudy sky outside. I stepped out, my legs weak and trembling. The air outside was cold, but it was real. I glanced back at the hospital, its facade looming silently in the dim light. It was just a building now, lifeless and still. I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow, as if I had left behind something important, something I would never fully understand. If this terrifying journey into the abandoned hospital, the wards that time forgot, sent chills down your spine, make sure to subscribe for more unsettling tales of the supernatural. Share your thoughts. What would you do if you were trapped in a haunted place like this? Hit that thumbs up if you crave more stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare.